My name is Sophia Larsen, and I'm 33 years old. I live in Boston, Massachusetts, and I run a social impact venture that uses drone imaging and AI to monitor coastal erosion. From the outside, my life might look like a post on TechCrunch, sleek, relentless, polished. But if you asked me where it all began, I wouldn't start with silicon chips or venture capital. I would start in silence, in the pale, hurricane-battered clapboard house by the Atlantic, its paint flaking like old memories. I have no recollection of my birth parents. According to the records I finally managed to read one winter afternoon, I was left alone on the stone steps of an Episcopal church in Charleston, South Carolina, at barely 2 years old. No note, no name tag, just me, wrapped in a ragged pink blanket, clutching a battered Raggedy Ann doll. A few days later, I was whisked away to my new home, the coastal cottage of Jonah and Marisol Chang, a couple in their late 40s who had never had children of their own. They lived 30 miles north of Boston, in a sleepy seaside town called Rockport. Marisol was a seamstress by trade, her fingers perpetually stained with threads of navy and teal, her small kitchen scented with jasmine tea and lavender sachets. Jonah, a former naval engineer turned charter boat captain, was broad-shouldered and quiet, his voice a deep rumble, his hands calloused from decades of salt spray and metal. I remember that first evening as they introduced themselves, Marisol guiding me by the hand into the living room full of sea blue cushions and driftwood decor. She knelt down, looked me in the eye, and said in a voice both warm and precise, "You're safe now, little star." And for a moment, I believed her. Their house was modest but bright, with tall windows that looked out over the rocky shoreline. In my small room, a hand-me-down crib stood next to an old rocking chair. Above it, a mobile of felt seagulls hung, swaying gently in the salt breeze that wafted in through a cracked window. I slept fitfully that first night, afraid I might awake somewhere else. But Marisol sat beside me on the edge of the crib, humming a lullaby in Spanish I couldn't understand, but felt like a promise. In the days that followed, Jonah would show me how to skip stones on the tide pools, crouching beside me on the granite ledges. "Try for 3 skips," he'd encourage in his quiet drawl, and I would grin when I managed even one. Marisol baked cornbread on Sundays, golden, buttery squares that filled the house with warmth. She'd perch me on the counter, hand me a wooden spoon, and say with a conspiratorial wink, "The secret ingredient is care, but don't tell anyone." I didn't know what care meant exactly, but I understood that in this house, someone had chosen me. I was 4 when everything began to shift. One crisp autumn day, with maple leaves drifting like embers across the gravel driveway, Jonah sat me at the kitchen table and gently announced that I was going to have a sister. Marisol was expecting a baby of her own. My heart swelled with delight. I spent afternoons making birthday banners from construction paper, singing to Marisol's still belly. I even picked out a name, Lily. But when Lily arrived on a rainy November morning, the cottage felt different. Marisol's soft gaze no longer drifted to me. It stayed fixed on the new crib beside mine. Jonah, once eager to play catch after long days on the water, now came home exhausted and went straight to his cabin study, leaving me alone with Lily's wails. The lullabies that used to soothe me were reserved for my sister, and I found myself standing at the doorway of the nursery, invisible as the salt mist outside. That was the beginning of my slow shrinking. I learned to make myself small, quiet at dinner time, careful not to spill a crumb on the kitchen floor. I took refuge in the attic, among old trunks of forgotten fishing nets and broken lanterns, where the dust motes danced like tiny spectres in the slanted sunlight. But even there, some fragile part of me still believed that if I proved myself, if I got perfect grades, if I learned to sew every stitch, if I never asked for anything, they would notice me again. And so, I tried. By the time Lily arrived, I understood the fragility of belonging. I was almost 5 when the first inklings of exclusion took root in our cottage. The day after her birth, I awoke early to the soft light filtering through the window and padded down the hall, eager to introduce myself to my new sister. But Marisol, her arms full of swaddled Lily, barely glanced in my direction. Her face was kind yet distant, as though I had become a shadow, edging too close to a brightness that only belonged to 2. Jonah's warmth receded too. He still took me out on his charter boat, but his eyes carried fatigue I had never seen before. Whereas once he would spend hours helping me tie knots or teaching me the names of gulls, now he spoke in clipped sentences. Keep your hands steady, don't lean too far over, and returned to his instruments below deck, leaving me to my solitude. Among the buoys and sea spray, at dinner, Marisol no longer asked about my day at the village school. Instead, she fussed over Lily's feeding schedule and diaper changes, humming lullabies I couldn't translate yet understood as promises I could no longer claim. I sat at the small kitchen table, my little legs dangling, tracing patterns in the tablecloth edge while Marisol meticulously packed Lily's bassinet with soft blankets. Every motion was precise and whispered. This is for her, not for you. Confusion and hurt twisted inside me as I realized that I, the once cherished little star, was fading. I learned to make myself small, folding my arms, sitting perfectly still, speaking only when spoken to. Even then, my words hung in the air unanswered. I tried to fill the silence with perfection. When Marisol taught me to sew pillowcases for her, I made each seam straight, each stitch even. When I brought home a drawing of the shoreline after art class, I pressed it into her hands, waiting for praise that never came. One afternoon, I found refuge in the attic where I used to play as a toddler. Dust-covered trunks and fishing nets smelled of distant voyages and untold stories. I curled up among the crates, clutching my Raggedy Ann doll, and pretended I was still the little girl who mattered. There, swaths of light filtered through the attic window, dust motes swirling like tiny lanterns, and I dared to imagine a place where I was seen, where my name meant something. As the months passed, I witnessed Lily's every milestone celebrated with delight. Her first laugh, her first tooth, her first steps. Each triumph echoed through the house like a chorus demanding attention. Meanwhile, my own achievements dissolved into the background. When I learned to ride a bicycle without training wheels, I coasted through Jonah's arms toward him, beaming. He patted my shoulder kindly and said, "Good job, Sophia," but then turned away to focus on Lily's stroller. One rainy evening, I stood at the doorway of my room, listening to the lullabies drifting from down the hall, and I realized I was invisible. The ache in my chest was sharp, like a pebble lodged in my heart. In that moment, I vowed that I would not remain unseen. I would find a way to carve out my own space, to prove that my worth was not borrowed, and that my voice, though small, deserved to be heard. That night, I lay awake, clutching Raggedy Ann, and imagined a life beyond the cottage walls, one where I would build something meaningful and find people who chose to see me for who I was. It was a fragile hope, but it felt like the first step toward a new story. In the weeks that followed, my resolve solidified. I threw myself into schoolwork with a precision I hadn't known I possessed. Math problems became puzzles to conquer. Literature, essays, opportunities to craft my voice on paper. I kept my grades pristine, determined that academic excellence might finally earn me a glimmer of acknowledgement. At home, I retreated to my desk in the attic, my sanctuary, and spent hours poring over textbooks by the slanted light of an old brass lamp. One Saturday morning, during a panic of rain that rattled the windows, I discovered a flyer tucked into the Elmwood Middle School's front office bulletin. Regional Science Fair, all grades welcome. My heart thumped as I read the details. This was more than a contest. It was a stage. I imagined standing beneath bright fluorescent lights, presenting my own invention to peers, parents, and judges. I filled out the entry form in careful script and slipped it back under the bulletin board pin, my pulse still racing. That afternoon, I ran home and found Jonah tinkering with his navigation equipment in the garage. My palms were sweaty when I approached. "Dad," I said softly, "I entered the science fair." He didn't look up, hands still adjusting dials. "That's good, Sophia." I waited for more. Encouragement, perhaps. But none came. So I nodded, turned, and carried my budding prototype upstairs. I called my project the Coast Watcher, a set of simple sensors hooked to a small motorized arm, designed to measure shifts in sand levels along the beach, and sound an alert if erosion accelerated. I scavenged parts from old electronics, a weathered anemometer from Jonah's boat, circuit boards from discarded radios, and a camera lens salvaged from a broken security system at the marina. Night after night, I soldered wires, wrote lines of code, and calibrated the sensors to detect changes in millimeters. My best friend, a girl named Neela Patel, whom I'd befriended in 6th grade, became my unofficial collaborator. Neela was quick-witted, outspoken, and endlessly supportive. When I confided in her about my home life, she didn't pity me. She listened, took notes, and offered ingenious tweaks. A pivot joint borrowed from a desk lamp here, a solar panel scavenged from a garden light there. We worked side by side in my attic workshop, our laughter and arguments echoing through the rafters. For the first time, I felt seen and understood. The day of the science fair arrived with a chill in the air, and a sky bruised purple by gathering clouds. I carried the Coast Watcher on a foam board base, my fingers trembling around the makeshift handle. At the gymnasium entrance, I spotted Marisol among the spectators, her arms folded, lips pursed. She caught my eye, half raised her hand in a perfunctory wave, then turned away. My chest tightened, but I forced a steady breath. In the gym, rows of trifold poster boards stretched across tables like a labyrinth. Other students displayed volcano models spewing baking soda lava, robotic arms lifting cups, and plant experiments measuring soil acidity. When the judges' panel reached my table, I launched into my presentation. Hello, I'm Sophia Larsen, and this is the Coast Watcher. It uses real-time data to alert coastal communities about erosion risks before they become disasters. I demonstrated the sensor readings on a small laptop screen, explained the potential for expanding to full-scale shoreline monitoring, and answered the judges' technical queries with confidence. As I spoke, I glimpsed Neela beaming beside me, giving me a thumbs up. When the awards were announced, I stood clutching Neela's hand with sweaty palms. First place, environmental innovation, the announcer called. My name echoed in the room, and for one shining moment, I was visible. I accepted the ribbon and certificate, lifted the Coast Watcher high, and felt a rush of triumph so fierce it threatened to upend every doubt I'd ever harboured. That night, as I lay in my attic, number 67 Elmwood Avenue, apartment 3B, Raggedy Ann tucked under my arm, I realised something profound. Recognition doesn't always come from those who neglected you. Sometimes it comes from strangers in a crowded gym, from a friend who refuses to look away, or from the quiet voice inside that refuses to be silenced. And though I was still living in that same cottage by the Atlantic, I carried a new certainty. I would not remain invisible. The momentum from the science fair victory carried me into the summer with an energy I had never felt before. While my classmates drifted off to vacation camps and beach parties, I set up a small lab in the garage. Old workbench salvaged from Jonah's tool shed, plastic storage bins filled with wires and microcontrollers, and a whiteboard scrawled with diagrams of coastal zones. I labelled the space the Shore Lab and threw myself into refining the Coast Watcher. That July, I entered a regional youth innovation challenge hosted by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's outreach program. The prize, mentorship from MIT engineers and a chance to pitch at the annual Coastal Resilience Summit. Neela helped me rewrite my proposal, emphasizing the system's real-time alerts and potential to integrate satellite data. I mailed the application on a rainy afternoon, my heart pounding as I sealed the envelope. One evening, as I soldered a new sensor array under the dim glow of a clamped lamp, Jonah wandered into the garage. He paused at the doorway, arms folded. "You're spending a lot of time here," he observed quietly. I held my breath, waiting for a reprimand, maybe even a reminder that chores awaited inside. Instead, he nodded toward my workbench. "Don't forget to eat," he said, voice softer than usual, and slipped out without another word. That small acknowledgement felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. I realized that even buried under years of indifference, there remained the faintest trace of parental care. I redoubled my efforts, coding algorithms that would allow the Coast Watcher to learn from historical tide data, adding encryption so alerts could be securely transmitted to local authorities, and designing a user interface that displayed erosion. Trends on a simple map. In mid-August, I received the acceptance letter. Congratulations, Sophia. You have been selected as one of 15 finalists in the MIT Coastal Resilience Youth Challenge. My hands trembled as I reread the words. I ran upstairs, bursting into Neela's room, waving the letter like a banner. She threw her arms around me, and for a moment, I forgot all the years I'd spent shrinking myself. Over the next 6 weeks, I balanced summer school safety workshops with lab hours. I built a prototype tower mounted on a wooden post that could pivot to face oncoming waves, and I trained its sensors using recordings from the town's weather station. I wrote a 10-page technical report and rehearsed my pitch until I could deliver it blindfolded. Night after night, I imagined standing before real engineers, explaining how my invention could protect threatened shorelines. September arrived with crisp air and the smell of fallen leaves. I travelled to Cambridge for the MIT showcase, carrying my scaled prototype, a poster board, and a portfolio. The Grand Hall buzzed with innovation, from biodegradable plastics to drone-powered reforestation. When my turn came, I spoke with clear precision. I'm Sophia Larsen from Rockport. Coastal erosion threatens millions of dollars in property and critical ecosystems. The Coast Watcher offers an affordable, scalable solution by coupling on-site sensors with AI-driven alerts. In pilot tests, our device detected shoreline shifts of up to 2 centimeters per day, allowing preventive measures before significant damage. The judges peppered me with questions about power management, data latency, and funding models. I answered each confidently, my hand steady around the prototype's controls. At the end, they smiled and thanked me. I stepped off the stage feeling exhilarated and utterly transformed. A week later, I learned I'd won the MIT prize, 6 months of mentorship from coastal engineers and a small grant to develop a full-scale unit. That night, alone in my attic once more, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth. I had something valuable to offer the world, regardless of whether I'd ever earn a parent's pride. For the first time, I was driven not by the need to be seen at home, but by a conviction that my work could make a real difference. And that realization felt like coming into the light at last. That autumn, I walked through the brick gates of Northeastern University, with a scholarship in one hand and a duffel bag slung over my shoulder. The campus bustled with ambition, students hurrying between lectures, posters for hackathons plastered to telephone poles, and the scent of pumpkin spice bubbling from coffee carts. I'd never felt more alive, or more unsettled. Academia was a whirlwind. I balanced coursework in environmental engineering and computer science with research under Dr. Elena Vasquez, a renowned expert in coastal modelling. My days began at dawn, coding algorithms before the first trains rattled past my dorm window. By afternoon, I was in Vasquez's lab, calibrating sediment transport models. Evenings found me in the student centre, leading workshops on Arduino and Python for underclassmen. Through it all, Neela remained my anchor, now my roommate, her laughter and late-night chai breaks keeping me grounded. In December, buoyed by the MIT prize and my growing expertise, I teamed up with 2 peers, David Kim, a marine biology major from San Diego, and Marissa Patel, a civil engineering student whose family ran a construction firm. Together, we founded ShoreGuard Innovations. Our mission was simple yet ambitious: transform the Coast Watcher from a prototype into a deployable system for at-risk communities. David studied local tide charts. Marissa designed rugged casing using 3D printers in the engineering workshop, and I integrated AI-driven analytics and user interfaces. Raising funding proved a formidable challenge. I pitched at campus incubators and local angel networks, clutching a shareable PDF and trembling with both hope and nerves. Many meetings ended in polite nods and sympathetic apologies. Great concept, Sophia, but the market's crowded. Or, we're looking for hardware with lower entry costs. Rejection piled up like driftwood at low tide. Some nights, I lay awake in my bunk bed, second-guessing every line of code and business plan slide. Then came the breakthrough Boston Summit in March. After a marathon of 15 pitches, we were one of 3 finalists in the Resilient Infrastructure category. Standing on the stage in a borrowed blazer, I took a deep breath. ShoreGuard Innovations protects vulnerable coastlines with real-time AI alerts and predictive modelling, I said into the microphone. Our system has already detected erosion rates of up to 4 centimetres per week in pilot sites, facilitating proactive reinforcement measures. We partner with municipalities to install low-cost sensor arrays that pay for themselves through reduced damage and insurance premiums. The judges, seasoned investors and city engineers, leaned forward, peppering me with questions about scalability, maintenance, and community engagement. I answered each with calm precision, drawing on months of research and field tests. When the winner was announced, $300,000 in seed funding, I felt a rush so intense it blurred my vision. With that capital, we leased a small workshop in the Seaport district and hired 2 interns who had shown promise in our university workshops. I moved out of the dorm, renting a tiny studio overlooking the Charles River, its grey waters reflecting my newfound resolve. I established a routine of sunrise runs to clear my mind, followed by back-to-back meetings with David, Marissa, and our interns, troubleshooting hardware glitches and refining our cloud-based dashboard. By summer's end, ShoreGuard had deployed its first commercial unit at a seaside town in Maine, monitoring erosion on a privately funded conservation project. Our dashboard displayed live data, shifting sand levels, wave intensity, and alert thresholds. Municipal engineers called us ghost sentinels, watching over the coastline even when no one was physically present. That fall, as I prepared my first tax returns as a CEO, I sat alone in my studio apartment, listening to the hum of my laptop and the distant tram closing its doors. I realized that I no longer sought validation from my childhood home. I had built something real, something that people depended on, and though I still carried fragments of that little girl who once felt unseen, I had woven those fragments into a tapestry of purpose, one that would continue to grow far beyond any single shoreline. The success in Maine opened doors I never imagined. In December, we received an invitation from the Norwegian Coastal Administration to pilot ShoreGuard on a stretch of fjord. Coastline north of Bergen. The proposal called for 6 sensor towers spaced along a rocky peninsula where melting permafrost and rising tides threatened local fishing villages. I felt equal parts exhilarated and terrified. This would be our first international deployment, and the stakes were immeasurably higher. In January, David, Marissa, and I flew to Bergen. I remember stepping off the plane into a chill so sharp it felt like it sliced through my jacket, and seeing the jagged peaks reflected in a glassy fjord. We spent days meeting with local engineers and municipal officials, hiking the rugged shoreline to identify optimal sensor sites and negotiating power sources. Solar panels would be unreliable in winter's dim light. In one long meeting in a turquoise-painted community hall, a grizzled fisherman named Eric leaned forward and asked in accented English, "Can your system really warn us before the ground gives way?" His gaze was direct, unblinking. I laid out our data models, showed him sample alerts, and demonstrated how predictive algorithms could forecast erosion surges from heavy rains. When I finished, he nodded slowly, as though weighing my words against years of hard-earned skepticism. "If it works," he said quietly, "you'll save lives and livelihoods." Installation took 3 frigid days. We mounted each ShoreGuard tower on galvanized steel mounts anchored securely into the bedrock, connected sensor arrays to reinforced enclosures, and calibrated the AI modules with local weather station data. At night, we huddled in the guest house over hot cocoa, swapping stories. Marissa shared how growing up near Boston Harbor sparked her passion for coastal safety. David recounted childhood mornings collecting tide pool specimens with his grandfather, and I spoke of the attic where I first dreamt of protecting shorelines. In those moments, I felt a deep kinship with my team, a chosen family bound by shared purpose. When we activated the system at dawn on the 4th day, the first readings trickled in. Micromillimeter shifts in sediment levels, wave height variance, temperature fluctuations. As the sun climbed, colours bloomed across the fjord, and I realised how extraordinary it was to witness real-time data painting the contours of change. We sent our first alert to the local monitoring station. Erosion rate spike detected, 3 millimeters in 2 hours. The engineers verified near the shoreline that a small section of embankment had slumped, exactly as predicted. News of our success spread quickly through the coastal community. Eric invited us to a communal fish stew gathering in a turf-roofed hut, where villagers praised ShoreGuard's potential. Their gratitude resonated inside me like a tide pushing outward, proof that our work had moved beyond charts and code to touch real lives. Returning to Boston in early spring, I carried with me a renewed sense of purpose. ShoreGuard Innovations was no longer a fledgling startup. It was a guardian for communities at the front lines of climate change. Back at the Seaport office, I updated investors on the Norway pilot, secured a new round of funding, and oversaw hiring of a full-time systems engineer to manage remote deployments. Yet, amidst the expansion, I never lost sight of why I'd embarked on this journey. In quiet moments, early mornings before the city awoke, or late nights listening to data streams, I remembered the little girl in the attic, dreaming by lamplight. I realized that protecting fragile coastlines was, in a way, my way of honoring that child, ensuring that no one else would feel invisible or powerless in the face of forces beyond their control. And that knowledge, more than any accolade, anchored me to the work I loved. By the time spring fully arrived, ShoreGuard Innovations was a thriving hub of activity. Our modest workshop in the Seaport district buzzed with interns soldering circuit boards, engineers troubleshooting sensor calibration, and a steady hum of data flowing through our cloud servers. Yet, amid the bustle, I felt an undercurrent of restlessness, a question that tugged at me each time I reviewed our quarterly metrics. Was I still chasing a need to be seen, or had I truly outgrown the shadows of my childhood? To find answers, I took a rare afternoon off and drove north along the coast toward Rockport. The winding road led me past marshlands dotted with egrets, red brick lighthouses perched against the horizon, and the small, clapboard house where my story began. My heart pounded as I turned onto Elmwood Avenue and pulled up in front of the number 67. The white paint was weathered, the sea blue shutters faded to grey, and the felt mobile of seagulls no longer hung in my old bedroom window. I hesitated before stepping onto the creaking porch, memories flooding back. Marisol's soft humming, Jonah's patient smiles. The first day Lily arrived. I pressed the doorbell, but no chime echoed inside. After a moment, I turned and left, the resolve and doubt swirling inside me like the tide. I realized that seeking their recognition again would risk reopening wounds I had spent years healing. Instead, I carried their unspoken absence with me as a reminder. My worth could not be defined by those who chose silence. Back in Boston, I channeled that clarity into our next project. A coastal town in Louisiana had reached out, citing extensive erosion that threatened its historic levees and threatened freshwater marshes home to migratory birds. Working with local environmental groups and tribal councils, we adapted the Coast Watcher for wetland monitoring, adding water quality sensors to detect salinity and nutrient shifts and programming AI models to recognize the subtle patterns of marsh degradation. Leading this initiative was both a professional milestone and a personal triumph. I travelled to the bayous in a rented SUV, swapping my tailored blazer for rubber boots and a wide-brimmed hat. I met Chief Marjorie LaSalle of the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe, whose ancestors had stewarded these lands for centuries. In a shaded communal longhouse, she spoke of the wetlands as living relatives. If the marsh dies, we die. Her words resonated deeply, connecting the eco-engineering work I loved with a cultural heritage of respect and reciprocity. Installation day dawned humid and grey as a summer storm brewed offshore. David and I waded through knee-deep water to place sensor modules atop custom floats, while Marissa secured solar wind hybrid power units on nearby cypress stumps. As weathered birds called overhead, I felt a familiar thrill. This was more than data. It was collaboration shared across generations and backgrounds. When the first marsh health alert pinged on our dashboard that evening, indicating increased salinity after a storm surge, I knew we were making a real difference. Upon returning to Boston, I shared our Louisiana success at a global climate conference, standing before diplomats, scientists, and NGO leaders. My pitch wasn't just about technology. It celebrated partnership, listening to indigenous knowledge, and ensuring that communities had agency over their own resilience strategies. The standing ovation that followed felt different from any earlier applause. It was a recognition of values, not just innovation. That summer, ShoreGuard Innovations grew into a fully staffed enterprise. We moved into a larger office with a view of the harbour, hired a dedicated community relations director, and launched a scholarship program for underrepresented youth in environmental engineering. Every time I signed a new intern's paperwork, I thought of the girl who once sat in a dusty attic, clutching her doll and dreaming of being seen. Now I was in a position to open doors for others, ensuring that those who felt invisible could find a place to shine. Yet even amid success, I carved out time for reflection. I kept a journal by my bedside, entries that acknowledged both the scars of the past and the strength I'd forged in response. I continued therapy with Dr. Clara Miles, exploring how my childhood shaped my leadership style and driven me toward projects rooted in care. And I stayed in touch with Neela, whose unwavering friendship reminded me daily that family could be chosen and cultivated through empathy and shared purpose. As I stood one evening on the rooftop terrace of our new office, watching the sun set over Boston Harbor, I realized how far I'd come. The pain of that coastal cottage, the sense of being unworthy, had given birth to a mission to protect fragile places and create spaces where people truly mattered. In that moment, I felt both gratitude and quiet resolve. I had learned that recognition from those who abandoned me might never come, and that was no longer my measure of worth. My legacy would be the lives saved, the coastlines preserved, and the young engineers who would carry this work forward. And that realization, more than any accolade, confirmed that my story had become something far greater than the search for a home. It had become a beacon for others still finding their way out of the shadows. Coming off the high of the Louisiana project, I found myself craving new horizons, not in geography, but in purpose. My days as CEO blurred into back-to-back strategy meetings, budget reviews, and investor calls. ShoreGuard Innovations was thriving, but I felt a subtle restlessness, like wind tugging at the sails of a ship cruising calm waters. I realized I needed to reconnect with the spark that had driven me as a child, the simple desire to be seen, to belong, and to protect. That realization led me back to my attic, now converted into a quiet study in my Boston studio. On a rough-hewn wooden shelf sat Raggedy Ann, a relic from Rockport days, her seams frayed but her eyes bright. I dusted her off one evening, holding her close as I flipped through my old journals. There, in wispy handwriting, were dreams of life-saving devices, pleas for recognition, and pages filled with raw grief. I understood then that the core of my work and my restlessness traced back to that little girl who needed reassurance that she mattered. To bridge the gap between childhood longing and adult achievement, I decided to launch a companion nonprofit alongside ShoreGuard, CoastKeepers Collective. Its mission was to mentor foster youth and adopted children through hands-on STEM workshops, providing both technical skills and the affirmation I once craved. I pitched the idea to ShoreGuard's board and secured seed funding for a pilot program in Boston public schools. Meanwhile, I redoubled my therapy sessions with Dr. Clara Miles, exploring the emotional terrain I'd long avoided. In one session, I recounted the day I first felt invisible, the moment Marisol snapped, "That's for Lily, not for you," and how that pain had fueled decades of striving. Clara listened without interruption, then said, "Your resilience is remarkable, Sophia, but healing requires gentleness too. Can you offer that to yourself?" Her question hung in the air, and I realized I'd never paused to care for the child I had been. Motivated by Clara's words, I organized ShoreGuard's first mindful resilience retreat for our core team. We rented a lakeside cabin outside Portland, Maine, and filled 2 days with guided meditation, peer sharing circles, and evening bonfires. As my colleagues shared stories of professional burnout and personal struggle, I felt a shift in our dynamic. We were no longer only co-workers, but a community bound by vulnerability and mutual care. That retreat became an annual tradition, reminding me that success without human connection can feel hollow. Back in Boston, CoastKeepers Collective held its inaugural workshop at East Boston High School. I taught a group of eager teens how to assemble simple sensor modules and write code to visualize data. Their eyes lit up when their handmade circuits blinked in response to simulated wave height changes. At the end, I asked them, "What keeps you motivated when things get tough?" A 14-year-old girl named Maya raised her hand and said softly, "Because someone believed I could." In that moment, I saw my younger self reflected in her, and I knew the work had meaning beyond any business metric. That autumn, as ShoreGuard prepared to deploy a network of sensors along a vulnerable coastline in Vietnam, I felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension. This time, I carried Raggedy Ann in my carry-on, a talisman reminding me both of where I'd come from and why I'd chosen this path. On the long flight to Ho Chi Minh City, I reviewed our deployment plan but also wrote a letter to my younger self, to Marisol and Jonah, to anyone who'd ever felt unseen, affirming worth beyond performance and promising that their stories mattered. In the glow of my tablet screen, I realized that my journey was not a straight line from neglect to triumph, but a weaving of innovation, vulnerability, and the courage to nurture both others and myself. And as the plane descended over the Mekong Delta, I knew that part 8 of my story was about embracing compassion as fiercely as I'd embraced success, and that the next chapters would unfold from that balance. Touching down in Ho Chi Minh City, I was greeted by humidity so thick it clung to my skin like a second layer, and the hum of motorbikes weaving through traffic like flocks of restless birds. I'd been here once before for a conference, but this time felt different. This was fieldwork at scale, deploying 50 ShoreGuard sensors along the Mekong Delta's fragile riverbanks. I stepped into the bustle of Tan Son Nhut Airport, Raggedy Ann tucked securely in my backpack, and was met by our local partner, Dr. Phan Minh An, a hydrologist whose calm focus mirrored my own. Over the next 2 days, Minh An guided me and our team across rice paddies and mangrove groves to scout sensor sites. The delta's water levels shifted with astonishing speed. At dawn, bone-dry mudflats. By midday, ankle-deep water. We selected sturdy casuarina tree roots and reinforced them with custom brackets Marissa had designed. As I hammered in the mounts, I remembered hammering tent stakes into my childhood yard to build forts, dreaming I might someday construct something permanent. Each morning before work, I rose at sunrise to watch the delta come alive, fishermen casting nets in narrow channels, water buffalo trudging through flooded fields, egrets lifting gracefully into the saffron sky. I realized that this landscape was more than a test site. It was a living tapestry, woven from generations of human and natural resilience. Deploying sensors here wasn't just about data. It was about honoring that bond and helping communities steward their heritage. On deployment day 4, the network went live. Data from each station, riverbank movement, sediment turbidity, and flood height began streaming into our cloud platform. Our local IT liaison, Nguyen, configured SMS alerts to village leaders, ensuring that even without smartphones, they'd receive critical warnings. I watched as the first alert popped up. Rapid erosion detected, 7 millimeters in 3 hours at Station 14. We confirmed via drone footage that a rivulet was carving into farmland, threatening rice crops. Within hours, community volunteers reinforced the bank with sandbags. That evening, Minh An invited me to dinner at her home, a simple wooden house on stilts overlooking a canal. Her elderly mother joined, offering bowls of steaming pho and plates of grilled fish. We ate under lantern light as fireflies danced above the water. Minh An's mother turned to me and said in halting English, "Thank you for caring our river." I felt a lump in my throat, recalling my childhood longing to be seen and valued. Here, across the world, strangers were acknowledging my work, not just as technology, but as compassion in action. The week culminated in a community workshop where we trained local volunteers to maintain the sensors and interpret the data. I watched young graduates, once wary of foreign consultants, light up as they realised they could use ShoreGuard to advocate for flood relief funds and sustainable farming grants. One volunteer, a slim man named Hai, thanked me for bringing a voice to his village's needs. His words struck me. Technology could give people a voice, just as I'd once craved one. On the flight back to Boston, I looked over my journal entries. Notes about sensor calibration, community feedback, and a letter I'd begun drafting to my younger self. You are seen. You are valued. Your story matters. I closed the notebook, feeling a deep sense of closure and renewed purpose. For decades, I chased acknowledgement. Now, I was helping others claim theirs. And in doing so, I finally understood how my own journey, from a frightened child in a pink blanket to a woman deploying resilience tools across continents, had been about one thing above all: turning invisibility into empowerment. Back in Boston, I walked into ShoreGuard Innovations' new headquarters, a converted loft overlooking the Fort Point Channel, with a quiet pride that still felt slightly surreal. The walls were lined with display screens, showing real-time data from deployments in Maine, Norway, Louisiana, and Vietnam. Interns clustered around high-top tables, soldering sensors. Engineers peered at code on dual monitors. A steady hum of conversation and collaboration filled the space. I paused at the entrance, took a steadying breath, and reminded myself. This was the culmination of a lifetime's work, born from the ache of being unseen, transformed into a mission to safeguard communities worldwide. That same afternoon, our communications director, Eleanor Reyes, handed me an email from a consortium of Pacific Island nations. Rising sea levels were threatening low-lying atolls, and they'd heard of ShoreGuard's success. They wanted to explore a pilot program to monitor shoreline changes and support early evacuation planning. As I read the message, I felt the familiar pull of both excitement and responsibility. This was more than a business opportunity. It was an invitation to extend our impact to some of the planet's most vulnerable populations. I assembled a rapid response team: Dr. Phan Min An, who knew the challenges of Delta regions, Marissa Patel, expert in rugged hardware design, and Neela Patel, now ShoreGuard's head of community outreach, whose empathy and organizational skills had become indispensable. We spent the next week drafting a proposal that wove together technical plans, cultural considerations, and partnership frameworks with island governments and NGOs. We mapped out sensor placements on coral reefs, mangrove swamps, and black sand beaches, ensuring local communities would lead installation and maintenance. Meanwhile, I carved out time for CoastKeepers Collective. Our pilot STEM workshops in Boston schools had shown that foster youth not only thrived with hands-on technical challenges, but also craved the affirmation that came with mentorship. I visited the East Boston program one afternoon, guiding a group of 9th graders through assembling simple water quality sensors. Seeing their eyes widen when their circuits lit up gave me a jolt of the same thrill I'd felt winning my first science fair. Afterward, as they clustered around me with questions about university life and career paths, I realized that my story of feeling invisible, then forging my own path, had become a beacon. That evening, I found myself back in the attic study of my studio apartment, writing in my journal by lamplight. I reflected on the journey so far. The little girl left on church steps, the swing sets and lullabies, the ache of losing her place when Lily arrived, the long nights in the attic that birthed dreams of being seen and of protecting others. I wrote down a promise to her that she would never again go unheard, that her resilience deserved celebration, that her worth transcended any home's neglect. On Friday, we held a company-wide Impact Day, inviting every member of ShoreGuard to share personal stories of why they joined the mission. When it was my turn, I stood before a room of colleagues, engineers, designers, outreach coordinators, interns, and recounted the story of my childhood. The fear, the rejection, and the turning point at the science fair, when I realized that recognition could come from work that mattered. As I spoke, I felt tears welling in my eyes, not of sorrow, but of release. At the end, the room rose in applause, and I saw faces glisten with empathy and respect. That night, I returned to my empty loft and sat beside Raggedy Ann, now perched on a shelf beside the journal. I whispered softly, "We did it. They see you." For so long, I'd chased external validation. Now, I understood that true belonging came from creating spaces where others felt seen, where technology served compassion, and where every voice, no matter how small, had power. As I turned off the lights and looked out over the city lights dancing on the water, I knew that part 10 of my story was about embracing community, both giving and receiving recognition, and that this spirit would guide the chapters yet to come. The following spring brought with it a flurry of activity on multiple fronts. ShoreGuard Innovations was preparing to begin the Pacific Islands pilot. CoastKeepers Collective was expanding to 3 additional schools, and I was scheduled to deliver the keynote address at the Global Resilience Forum in London. Each accomplishment felt like another brick in the foundation I'd built from scratch. Yet, as I packed my suitcase for Heathrow, I sensed a familiar undercurrent of anxiety. Public speaking had once terrified me more than any court appearance, because standing before strangers forced me to reckon with that childhood fear of invisibility. On the morning of my flight, I stood in my studio apartment one last time before the mirror. I smoothed the lapels of my navy blazer and tucked a silver pendant, a small seagull, in flight, gifted by Jonah long ago, beneath my blouse. I closed my eyes, inhaled deeply, and whispered, "You are seen. You are worthy." Then I slipped on my coat, grabbed my carry-on, and headed for Logan Airport. The forum's grand hall was filled with delegates from governments, NGOs, and businesses, all focused on adapting to a changing climate. I stepped onto the stage under warm spotlights and scanned the audience, row upon row of expectant faces. My pulse quickened, but I remembered the science fair podium and the MIT showcase, and I found my center. "Good morning," I began, voice steady. "I'm Sophia Larsen, CEO of ShoreGuard Innovations and founder of CoastKeepers Collective. 29 years ago, I was just a child left on church steps, with no certainty of belonging. Today, I stand here to share how we can transform vulnerability into resilience, both for communities and for children who, like I once was, feel unseen." I spoke of sensor networks in Maine, fjords in Norway, bayous in Louisiana, deltas in Vietnam, and atolls in the Pacific, each deployment a testament to technology infused with empathy. I shared stories of fishermen in Norway, tribal stewards in Louisiana, village volunteers in Vietnam, and island councils in the Pacific, emphasizing that true resilience emerges when local knowledge and innovative tools converge. Then I turned to CoastKeepers. By mentoring foster youth in STEM, we not only build future engineers, but also heal the wounds of abandonment by showing these young people they are valued and capable of shaping the world. As I wrapped up, I invited a young delegate from Tuvalu onto the stage. Her village was one of our first Pacific pilot sites. She spoke briefly of her pride in using ShoreGuard data to secure early warning funding and, turning to me, thanked me for believing in her community. The hall erupted in applause, and I felt tears prickle my eyes. Not from fear or sorrow, but from the deep recognition that my story, once veiled in shame, had become a catalyst for others. Back in my hotel room that evening, I sat by the window overlooking the Thames and reflected on how far I'd come. I drafted a letter to Jonah and Marisol, my Rockport parents, to thank them for the home they gave me, even if it fractured. I acknowledged their early kindness and the life lessons taught by their later distance, which propelled me toward resilience and purpose. I hesitated over the send button, uncertain if I wanted to open old wounds. Ultimately, I set the draft aside, realizing that closure didn't require their response. It required my own forgiveness and acceptance. Returning to Boston a few days later, I found ShoreGuard's mailbox flooded with partnership inquiries from 5 new island nations, and CoastKeepers was invited to present at an international education summit. I celebrated with my team at our rooftop terrace, sharing sparkling cider and laughter as the city skyline glowed at dusk. I watched their faces, enthusiastic, determined, proud, and I understood that being seen by them was more precious than any childhood acknowledgement I'd sought. That night, I placed the unsent letter back in my journal and added a new entry. You gave yourself the gift of purpose, Sophia. You are enough. As I closed the journal and drifted to sleep, I felt a quiet certainty. The chapters ahead would continue weaving innovation with compassion, ensuring that every person and shoreline we touched would know they mattered. Summer in Boston arrived with a rush of warmth and possibility. ShoreGuard Innovations had just completed a successful pilot on 5 Pacific Island atolls, and CoastKeepers Collective was wrapping up its second year of STEM mentorship with over 70 foster and adopted youth served. Yet amid the victories, I felt a growing pull toward deeper impact, towards systemic change rather than isolated projects. One evening, as I walked along the harbour walk past bobbing sailboats, I reflected on how my life had intertwined technologies of resilience with the human need to belong. I realised that, while our sensors watched coastlines, we needed a way to watch communities of youth, to help those at risk of falling through society's cracks. That night, I drafted the framework for a third initiative, the Lighthouse Network, a coalition of nonprofits, schools, and civic partners dedicated to pairing each foster teen with a mentor in STEM fields, ensuring ongoing guidance, advocacy, and real-world experience. I proposed the Lighthouse Network to ShoreGuard's board and to the CoastKeepers Advisory Council. Both groups recognised its potential to scale our work. ShoreGuard would provide technical resources and data platforms, CoastKeepers would leverage school partnerships, and new non-profit collaborators would recruit mentors and secure funding. Within 2 months, we had a steering committee and seed grants from 2 philanthropic foundations. In September, I launched the first Lighthouse cohort at the Boston Public Library, assembling a roomful of eager teens, volunteer mentors, and community leaders. I opened the program with my story. Left on church steps, adopted into a loving yet tumultuous home, driven to excel in science fairs and college, and ultimately becoming a leader in climate resilience. I emphasized one core idea: no one should navigate life storms alone. With a trusted guide, every challenge becomes surmountable. Over the next weeks, mentors, engineers, data scientists, environmental planners met their mentees for hands-on workshops and one-on-one sessions. I watched as a shy boy named Malik, once reluctant to speak up, presented his first coded infographic on air quality data, and I witnessed a resilient young woman, Anna, draft a grant proposal to secure funding for green infrastructure in her neighbourhood. Their pride mirrored the validation I had long sought, and now I saw it bloom in others. Meanwhile, ShoreGuard's engineering team prepared for a deployment along the Arctic coastline in northern Greenland, an area experiencing rapid permafrost thaw. I joined the planning calls, balancing technical logistics with community engagement plans, ensuring that Indigenous Inuit partners would co-lead sensor sighting and data interpretation. Amid these initiatives, I carved out time for personal reflection. I resumed bi-weekly sessions with Dr. Clara Miles, exploring the nuances of leadership and self-care. Clara reminded me that sustainable impact required sustainable practices, both for organizations and for individuals. I began practicing daily mindfulness, taking sunrise jogs along the Charles River, and dedicating Sunday afternoons to reading fiction or tending my small balcony garden. As autumn turned to winter, I looked over our collective achievements, coastlines monitored in 6 countries, dozens of foster youth mentored, and a network of over 50 dedicated mentors poised to expand nationwide. Sitting in my office, I drafted the next chapter of my journal. From the silence of that early morning in Rockport to the voices rising across oceans and cities, my journey has always been about connection, between people, between past and present, and between technology and compassion. The Lighthouse Network ensures that no one, child or coastline, faces the dark alone. And with that conviction, I stepped forward into part 13. As the calendar turned to the new year, I felt a familiar thrill of anticipation and a measure of trepidation, knowing that our work was expanding on multiple fronts. ShoreGuard Innovations was preparing to deploy our Greenland system in early spring. CoastKeepers Collective was planning its first national conference for foster youth STEM mentorship, and the Lighthouse Network was launching pilot chapters in 3 additional states. Each venture brought its own challenges, logistical puzzles, and opportunities for impact. In late January, I flew to Nuuk, Greenland's capital, to oversee the Arctic deployment. The moment I stepped off the propeller plane into the crisp polar air, I was struck by the vastness of the ice fjords and the resilience of the local community. Our partner, Kalalit Nunaat University's Environmental Science Department, had identified 6 priority sites where permafrost thaw was already undermining coastal infrastructure. As I toured the snow-swept terrain with Professor Akaluk Peterson, a soft-spoken Inuk hydrologist, I felt both the gravity of our mission and the privilege of bearing witness to a landscape in transformation. Installation was arduous. We braved sub-zero temperatures to mount sensor arrays on reinforced steel frames, burying data cables beneath frost-hardened soil and securing solar wind hybrid power units against gusting winds. At night, our small team huddled in the university's heated lab, reviewing live readings as the sensors captured millimeter-scale ground movements beneath the aurora-lit sky. When the first alert registered, indicating a rapid thaw event near a remote fishing hamlet, I coordinated with the local council to dispatch maintenance crews and reinforce vulnerable embankments. Seeing protective sandbags and timber bracing arrive before the next thaw cycle reinforced the life-saving potential of our technology. Returning to Boston 2 weeks later, I immediately plunged into planning for the CoastKeepers Collective conference. We'd secured the historic Boston Athenaeum for the event, intending to bring together mentors, mentees, educators, and non-profit leaders for panels, workshops, and networking. In the weeks leading up, I worked with our events team, led by my longtime friend and operations director, Vivian Chu, to craft a program that balanced inspiration with practical skill building. We invited speakers ranging from NASA engineers to social workers, each sharing how mentorship in STEM can transform trajectories. On the morning of the conference, I stepped onto the Athenaeum stage, its vaulted wooden ceiling rising above rows of seats filled with eager faces. 13-year-old mentees in CoastKeepers t-shirts, volunteer mentors clutching notebooks, and educators from across the region. I opened by recounting a moment from my own youth, how winning my first science fair made me visible for the first time, and then challenged the audience. Visibility without opportunity is only half the promise. Our job is to pair attention with action. The auditorium echoed with applause, and I sensed a shared commitment to make that promise tangible. Meanwhile, back at ShoreGuard headquarters, the Lighthouse Network team was finalizing partnerships in Texas, Oregon, and New York. We had already vetted mentor applicants, trained regional coordinators, and aligned curricula with local schools. Each coordinator would host monthly meetups, hands-on projects in robotics, environmental monitoring, and data visualization, coupled with one-on-one career coaching. I participated virtually in their first planning call, offering encouragement and reminding everyone that, even amidst busy schedules, small gestures, a handwritten note, a quick check-in call, could change a young person's life. That evening, as I sat in my studio apartment overlooking the Charles River, I allowed myself a rare moment of stillness. I reflected on how the little girl once hidden behind driftwood and dust motes had grown into a leader whose work now spanned polar ice to tropical deltas, that she had created systems ensuring no shoreline, no foster teen, and no aspiring engineer would face their storms alone. I opened my journal and wrote, Part 13. When the work becomes a chorus of voices, Arctic guardians, young mentors, community stewards, you realize that resilience is built not by one person, but by a network of believing hearts. With that affirmation warming me like a hearth, I closed my journal and whispered into the quiet, we're just getting started. Late spring brought a surprising invitation that tested how far I'd truly come. Elmwood Middle School in Rockport reached out to ask if I would return as their commencement speaker. It felt like a circle closing, back to the corridors where I once felt invisible, asked now to lend my voice. I hesitated only for a moment before accepting. This was not about seeking validation from Marisol and Jonah, but about affirming every child who still needed to hear that they mattered. A week later, I drove up the coastal road, watching familiar landmarks glide by. The marshes flecked with egrets, the weathered red lighthouse, the narrow driveway leading to number 67 Elmwood Avenue. My heart fluttered as I parked near the school's small auditorium, its windows reflecting a radiant sunset. Neela joined me, now my closest confidant and ShoreGuard's head of outreach, and handed me a glass of sparkling water. "You ready?" she asked quietly. I nodded, smoothing the lapel of my blazer. Inside, the gymnasium buzzed with energy. 8th graders in caps and gowns, proud parents, and a handful of teachers I vaguely recognized. As I stepped to the podium, I scanned the crowd, half expecting Marisol or Jonah to appear in the back row. They did not. Instead, I saw bright-eyed children looking up at me with eager curiosity, and in that moment, I understood. This was never about their applause. It was about theirs. I began. 30 years ago, I sat where you are now, surrounded by hopeful faces, dreaming of what comes next. Back then, I carried secrets of loneliness and fear that no gown or diploma could erase. But today, I stand here to tell you, your story, no matter how quiet, has power to change the world. I shared snippets of my journey, winning my first science fair, braving deployments in Norway's fjords and Vietnam's deltas, and founding CoastKeepers and the Lighthouse Network to ensure no child feels unseen. I told them that resilience is not about never stumbling, but about knowing there's a hand to help you back up. As I spoke, a hush fell over the room, broken only by the crackle of the sound system and the gentle hum of anticipation. Afterward, as the applause swelled, a teacher guided me backstage where I found a single note taped to the wall. "Thank you for coming home." My throat tightened. I unfolded the card. Inside, an illustration of a paper boat afloat on calm water and a handwritten message. "You always had a way of finding your own current. We're proud of you." Your parents, Marisol and Jonah, stood quietly to the side, their eyes glistening. I felt a torrent of memories and emotions, gratitude for their early kindness, sorrow for their later distance, and a curious, tender warmth that sprang from forgiveness. I stepped forward, opened my arms, and they embraced me. I didn't say a word. None was needed. In that fleeting hold, I understood that belonging can be reclaimed not by perfection, but by vulnerability and grace. That evening, as I drove back to Boston under a sky streaked with pink and gold, I held their note against my heart. I realized that my story had come full circle. From a frightened child seeking recognition to a leader creating platforms where every voice could be heard. The ache of being unseen had guided me toward building resilience, not just for coastlines, but for people. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, global deployments, non-profit expansions, and the final chapter of my own journey. But in that moment, between Rockport and Boston, I felt a quiet certainty. I was home, at last, in my own story. The morning after the Rockport commencement, I awoke before dawn, sunlight pooling across my studio floor. I felt the soft weight of closure and a burgeoning anticipation for what lay ahead. My journey, from the frightened child abandoned on church steps to standing reunited with Marisol and Jonah, had been woven through 15 parts of resilience, innovation, and compassion. Now, it was time to turn the page. I began the day with a ritual I'd adopted during my early startup years. A quiet walk along the harbour walk, coffee in hand, watching boats drift beneath the rising sun. As I strolled, I reflected on our global impact. Sensor networks safeguarding shorelines from Maine's rocky cliffs to Greenland's permafrost. Mentorship programs lighting sparks in foster youth across American cities. And community-led deployments in Vietnam and the Pacific. Each success had begun with a single spark of determination, fueled by my own longing to be seen and valued. Back at ShoreGuard's headquarters, the team greeted me with enthusiastic updates. The Pacific Islands pilot had secured government funding to expand to 8 nations. The Lighthouse Network's first cohort of mentors had secured internships for their mentees, and CoastKeepers Collective was partnering with a national children's hospital to integrate environmental health workshops into patient support programs. I paused to absorb their reports, quietly proud that our projects had matured into self-sustaining ecosystems of care and innovation. By mid-morning, I settled into my office, walls lined with maps, photographs of deployments, and framed thank you letters from students and community leaders. I opened my journal and wrote, Part 15, Integration and Renewal. For me, this meant weaving together every thread of my work into a cohesive vision for the future. I drafted a strategic plan that emphasized 3 pillars: technological innovation for ecological resilience, mentorship and empowerment for underserved youth, and community partnerships rooted in mutual respect and cultural knowledge. That afternoon, I held a roundtable with department heads, engineering, outreach, nonprofit programs, and finance to align our goals. We discussed scaling operations responsibly, investing in staff well-being through expanded mindful resilience retreats, and building bridges between our coastal projects and youth programs so that young people could witness firsthand how data and empathy combine to protect environments and communities. I emphasized that our strength lay in collaboration and the lived experiences we honored, whether that of an 8-year-old student or a Norwegian fisherman. As twilight approached, I left the office and drove to a small park overlooking the Charles River. I carried Raggedy Ann in my jacket pocket, a reminder of the child who once needed someone to say, "You matter." I sat on a bench and watched lights shimmer on the water, breathing deeply. In that stillness, I acknowledged all that had shaped me: the pain of being overlooked, the thrill of discovery, the solidarity of chosen family, and I felt gratitude. Before returning home, I pulled out my phone and recorded a voice memo. To every child who feels invisible, know that your story holds power. Your worth isn't proven by a birth certificate or a grade. It's proven by your courage to keep going, your curiosity to learn, and your compassion for others. We see you, we believe in you, and we're building pathways for you to thrive. Later that night, I sat at my desk and penned the final entry in my journal. From Rockport to Boston, from dust-filled attics to global summits, my journey has been guided by the simple truth that every life deserves recognition, every coastline protection, and every voice a chance to be heard. As I close this chapter, I open the next, with purpose renewed, community strengthened, and a heart ready to champion both people and planet. The story continues. With that, I closed the journal, turned off the lamp, and looked out at the city lights, ready for whatever the future would bring, confident that visibility and care remain at the heart of all I do.